Thank you so much for coming to our event. Welcome on behalf of the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights, Our Bodies, Ourselves Today, and also the Ford Hall Forum. I'm Amy Agigian, the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights and Our Bodies, Ourselves Today here at Suffolk. We are so happy that you could join us for an Our Bodies, Ourselves conversation on sex and aging. This is a very much needed discussion in our society, and we're excited to see how it's going to unfold with everybody. I would like to thank not only all of you for coming, but also I want to thank our speakers, Judy and Heather. I want to thank the Our Bodies, Ourselves Today team who organized the event and who are here making everything run smoothly. That includes especially Laura Prieto, Grace Cook, and our students, our intrepid and wonderful students, Aradna, Bryn, and Eliza. Of course, I thank our co-sponsor, the Ford Hall Forum, as well as Trader Joe's, which donated some of the delicious food we have tonight. So, thanks to everybody. I want to give a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Boston is located on the traditional and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have been brilliant stewards of the land and water for hundreds of generations. Specifically, the Massachusetts and Wampanoag First Nations peoples, along with particular recognition for the Pawtucket, Neponset, and Nipmuc peoples, who have traveled, lived, worked, and cared for the lands in and around Boston for tens of thousands of years. We extend respect and gratitude to all First Nations people who continue to live and steward in the cultural, spiritual, and educational customs of their ancestors. We also acknowledge the overwhelming violence, physical, cultural, environmental, and spiritual, that has been inflicted by colonialism for over 400 years and which continues to this day to profoundly affect the lives of Indigenous peoples. We express our deep respect and appreciation for Massachusetts women, men, children, and elders, both leaders and ordinary people. We also know that a land acknowledgement is not enough and commit Our Bodies, Ourselves Today to honoring and lifting up Indigenous voices and perspectives in all of our work. On a very practical basis, we are asking you all to wear masks in here if you are physically able. People on the stage are not going to be wearing masks while we're on the stage, but we will when we come off. And we have masks and hand sanitizer available to everybody. And also, we want to ask you to please silence your cell phones for the duration. And I'm going to hand it over to Grace Cook, who will introduce tonight's panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and hi, everybody on Zoom or far away. My name is Grace Cook. I'm the Program Associate for Our Bodies, Ourselves Today, and I get to introduce our lovely panel speakers tonight. Right here, we have Heather Corinna. Want to wave your hand, Heather? Heather is a queer and non-binary feminist activist, author, educator, artist, and organizer. Heather is the Content Expert Chair for the Our Bodies, Ourselves Today Sexualities, Gender, and Relationships panel. They are the founder, director, designer, and editor of the web clearinghouse and organization Scarletine, the first comprehensive sex, sexuality, and relationships education site and resource of its kind in operation since 1998. Heather was also a writer and contributing editor of the 2011 edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves, the book. They are navigating middle age and all it entails with as much grace as they can, and currently live and work in their hometown on unceded land of Chicago. And then we also have the wonderful Judy Norsigian. Want to wave your hand, Judy? Judy is a prominent advocate for women's reproductive health and was the co-founder of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, better known by its best-known book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. Editor of each of these 9 editions of the book and executive director of the collective from 2001 to 2015. and its chair from 2018 to 2023. Judy is an important public intellect on women's health issues and has served on numerous boards and advisory groups relating to reproductive health, contraception, and medical research. Judy was also named one of the 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News and recognized by the Boston YWCA Academy of Women's Achievers. She received the Public Service Award from the Massachusetts Public Health Association and the Humanist Heroine Award from the American Association of Humanities. It continues, and received the Radcliffe College Alumna Association Recognition Award. You are amazing, Judy. And we also have Aida Manduley, who is not here today, but Aida is an award-winning Latinx organizer, trauma-focused therapist, and intergenerational presenter, known for tackling taboos and building bridges. They are also a content expert on our Bodies, Ourselves Today, Sexualities, Gender, and Relationships panel. Aida is trained as a sexuality educator, social worker, and nonprofit executive. They are always working to make the world a more equitable place and maximize kindness while retaining both a sense of humor and a sense of justice. And Aida is unfortunately sick tonight and cannot join us in person, but they are on the Zoom, for those of you on Zoom, and they're able to answer questions on the Zoom. And with that, I will turn it over to Heather to start your panel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Grace. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Judy, for being here.
After 25 years, we finally meet.
I
This is
know.
amazing.
We've known each other virtually, but not in
together
person.
for
I'm going
so
to try
long.
not to be too weird about it, but I'm going to be weird about it. So we agreed that we're going to kind of start here. I want to first talk, and maybe you can start, Judy, to kind of talk about what our expectations were of sex and aging, both when we were growing up, but then also at the time of life when we were starting to approach aging. So when you or I envisioned what did it look like to be a sexual being as an older person, what did we think about?
That's a very interesting question. I don't remember that much about my thoughts when I was really young, except that I did have an aunt who's no longer alive who told me about sexual intercourse when I was about 5 years old. I did know a little bit about anatomy, and all I could think about was that big penis on a man fitting into my little vagina, and that would be very painful. I remember that's one thought I had about sex as a very young kid. I also was fascinated by these manuals, sex manuals for married people. And when I was about 11 or 12, my buddy, I think we were in 6th grade then, we would go into her parents' room, and she knew where the marriage sex manual was for them, and we would pore over it together. And it had interesting things in there about how to raise kids as well. Both of us had masturbated, and I think we talked about it, I don't even remember. But in this book, it said, don't hit your child's hand, meaning male child, because this was the idea that little boys would play with their penises. Don't be punitive. This is a normal process of discovering your body. Be nice to your kids when you see them masturbating or holding their genitals in their hands. Not much about little girl children, but a lot about little boy children. That's the kind of thing that I remember from being a kid. And then, of course, you get into your early teens and you're starting to get, crushes on kids in your class or older kids and, all kinds of romantic notions, some of them from books, some of them from movies. But what we didn't have, what I believe now is the most horrific influence on young people today, is this massive cesspool on the internet. There might have been some things that were a little bit off. I remember discovering my uncle's pornographic stash, some magazines in his closet. Maybe I was 14, I don't know. But nothing that I saw in those magazines comes close to what I then learned about as an adult that was purveyed as porn, some of it very violent, and some of it reaching very young men in particular in their early teens. I think that has shaped thinking about sexuality in a way that has been profoundly destructive, but I could never prove it.
Yeah. I mean, see, I got lucky because Our Bodies Ourselves was in my purview, and there was a growing older section in Our Bodies Ourselves from pretty much right away, right? So I didn't have to kind of live without that. I remember I was thinking about this when I was thinking about this question. I got lucky in that for whatever reason, I think it was important to my dad that I didn't have kind of anti-sex or ageist ideas about older people. And I remember my dad, when I was maybe 14, 15, really wanting me to see the movie Shirley Valentine. Has anyone seen the movie Shirley Valentine in here? Have you not seen this movie? There's this, it's an older woman, and she has a terrible marriage in the UK, and she runs off to Greece. And she's probably in her 50s, and she has this marvelous love affair. There's this magnificent scene in which she rips off her clothes in her normal 50-year-old body and jumps off the boat into the ocean. And so I think in some ways, and again, by virtue of kind of the legacies that happened in the early 70s, right about the time that I started to grow up, I had quite a lot of examples of people getting older. And I do think now, something we certainly see a little bit more of, and I don't know, is that media certainly doesn't help, whether that media is sexual media or it's advertising. I do think that there's still a lot of kind of collective ew and yuck from younger people when we talk about sex and older people, because of course what's being marketed to people by all means, which to me to some degree is almost even more noxious than what's in pornography, because pornography isn't on the side of a bus, but advertising is on the side of the bus. It's everywhere. And if the only images that we're shown of quote unquote sexy people are all people who are under 30, then it's obviously going to be very hard for us to envision what does it look like to be a sexual person who is in fact over 30, over 50, over 70?
When I was in my early 20s, I connected with women in the Our Bodies Ourselves group, Boston Women's Health Book Collective. I hadn't thought much about sex and older people. I knew people had sex, throughout their lives. I knew my grandmother was sexually active, but that is when I began to get my eyes open, because there were feminists already writing about this. There was Rosetta Writes, and she did this wonderful book about menopause.
Her menopause book, okay, Rosetta Writes, right? I didn't know if it was Reitz or Writes. That's the best menopause book in the history of menopause books that I've found. And she does talk quite a lot about sex. It's amazing.
And it was the readings that I did in my 20s that really made me understand that sexuality was very variable for women. Mm-hmm. And there were women writing about the fact that they had lower libido as they got older. That's fine. Some women didn't even care. Some women were upset by it. They actually wanted to return to that. They liked it when they had a lot of libido. Mm-hmm. And it didn't have even to do with whether they were partnered or not. Mm-hmm. It was just, they either liked it or didn't. And that women were discovering sex toys, and they were masturbating, particularly when they didn't have a partner. If they had a partner who was really responsive and was interested in their sexual pleasure, which, as we know now, not many women were successful in those days in having such partners, but they were very keen on maintaining the sensuality that came with that stimulation, and not even necessarily having orgasm, but just feeling that kind of sensuality. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was understanding that so much about our sexual response is in the brain. It is in how we're thinking, how we're feeling. It's not necessarily a biomedical issue, mm-hmm. or a completely physical response to certain things in our bodies that happen irrespective of what we're thinking and feeling. And of course, as we know from the late 90s, and I think it was March of '98 when Viagra got approved as for male sexual dysfunction, we then saw this onslaught of biomedical interest in sexual pleasure and arousal and the redefinition of all of the challenges and what we might even ourselves call problems as not something to do with our relationships, with our understanding of our body and communicating our sexual needs and what felt good and what didn't to our partners, even to ourselves. But it was much more about what biomedical pharma solution are we going to come up with that will solve your problem? And because it's so much easier to talk about, gender in the abstract or biomedical problems than it is to talk about, stimulating breasts and nipples and all of that, people, I think, flock to a biomedical solution much more readily, and they're much more readily duped. We can get into this later, but it was very interesting to see how many of these drugs for women's sexual dysfunction, as they called it, were, shot down when the FDA had its advisory committees looking at the data. This ain't effective, and sometimes it's not even safe.
Right. I'm glad that you bring that up, too, because the next place that I was thinking about was to kind of talk about the impacts of ageism with this. And I do think that one place where there's a big intersection of sex and ageism is the idea that getting older and what happens to our bodies as we get older is necessarily a problem to be solved, right? Rather than that we change and we can adapt or we cannot adapt. But if we're trying to keep our mind in a place of adaptation, we can't really think about ourselves as being problems to be fixed or to be solved. And I think that sometimes, even when you're talking about something like Viagra, for instance, somebody who has a penis, who's getting older, who wants to keep having erections because that's the way that they're used to being sexual, has a couple options, right? They can absolutely seek out Viagra and do it that way, but what's less talked about, I think, is that there's also an option to say, hey, my body's changing, so how does my sexuality then change with my body? Because you can do that too. You can say, oh, this doesn't do what it used to do, but what haven't I explored in my lifetime because I've been so focused right here to not see the rest of it?
This is a good moment for me to mention an article that I just looked at from July of this year. So most of my interest in this issue really goes back decades, and I think some of the lessons we learned and other feminists learned still hold for women as we age. And, the responses and our feelings and libido, all of those things do change, sometimes gradually over time, sometimes very starkly, suddenly. But this is a piece that was in the AARP newsletter, I think, and it was it was from July, and it was titled, "Are You an Older Woman Who's Given Up on Having Sex? Why?" And she goes on and on. It's not a long article, but she cannot fathom how anyone could possibly think about a positive life without it being also sexually active with a partner in her mind. And she asks these questions, and she's asking readers to respond. And in fact, it's almost dismissive of what many women's experiences have been. And they either have or haven't had very active sexual lives, but they are in a different place at that point. And as women age, they describe so many variables in what they want to do with their lives then, with or without partners, with or without a lot of sexual arousal, and reading and listening to the variable sort of interest levels that women have, and the fact that they can be totally happy choosing this whole array of ways to go about changes in libido and sexual response. It's kind of reductionist to think that, if you're going to be a healthy person, you have to have an active sex life, or you've got to be having your orgasms, or you've got to be at least masturbating. Well, some women don't miss it, they don't care about it, and they are perfectly happy. Lenore Tiefer once gave a very funny talk in which she mentioned that she went to the opera all the time, and it served for her the role that sex served for other people, and she got a laugh out of her audience from that.
Well, I think you'd like to also think that if nothing else that you've earned in later life, you should have the thing that you should have had all along, which is the option, right? Like the idea that there's an obligation, right? And I think that's another thing, is that a lot of people, women and gender-expansive people, have come up without really feeling that it was fully optional for them to be sexual or not, right? And obviously, ideally, no one should ever feel that way. Hopefully, we're building a world here where people are growing up not having that happen at all. But we know, right, that there's whole generations of women particularly that wasn't a choice, that I certainly hope that by the time that someone is in their 50s and their 60s and their 70s, that if they haven't felt free before, to say no or maybe or not as often or in this different way than I did before that you do now, the idea that there's still pressures to kind of conform is actually, it's heartbreaking, I think.
But just to, also acknowledge that for some women, the changes were not pleasant. And for some women, if you read what they write, they did use testosterone even in ways that made them happy. And there are biomedical approaches to our changes in response, sexual response, that for some women have really just touched the right note for them.
Absolutely. Right. Then that's it, right? It should be options. All of these things should be options. We should get more options.
It's the idea that you
as we
should.
get older, not less options as we get older.
Right. Right.
What else? If we're thinking about, I don't know what I'm thinking. There's kind of two things that I think often kind of get in the biggest way of us thinking about sex and aging in ways that are positive, affirming, diverse, certainly, and ageism and ableism, right, are the two big ones. Because then when we go back to where we're talking about bodies as problems, there is still the cultural idea that if anything in your body doesn't work in this ideal way that we've decided what a normal body is, right, what a normal body looks like, what a normal body does, then again, something is necessarily wrong or falling apart, rather than looking at that again. We can adapt, whether what we're adapting to is chronic illness, or what we're adapting to is arthritis, or what we're adapting to is dementia, or we're adapting to social pieces, right? So maybe you've had a partner for 30 years, and that's not your partner anymore because your partner's passed on.
And also, ageism can rear its head in a number of different ways. And for some women, there's this internalized notion that you have to look, the young nubile body or whatever. You have to look like this idealized version of what it means to be female in this society, or else you're not attractive, and you don't even feel like you can venture into that world of, a mutually satisfying sexual relationship with someone because you just don't feel good about your body. And that is very common, that we kind of succumb to the myths around us of what it means to be beautiful, what it should mean to be beautiful. And that's too bad. I mean, and there's beautiful writing by women and men about accepting their aging bodies as beautiful and still feeling the kind of arousal that comes from appreciating that body, even though it might be aging, your own and your partner's, and being able to move into that phase of your lives with a kind of pleasure and grace and acknowledgement that the prevailing culture is sending all the wrong messages, but somehow you're able to escape that. Not many people do, I think.
But right, and what a trap it is, though, too, right, to think that you grow up and the message is that no body can be perfect enough while you have the young body. And then as you get older, that it's the same message except in a different place. But there's no sweet spot. Like, everybody doesn't get to be 35 and just perfect and feel great about themselves and not worry about it anymore. Like, there's a terrible anti-positive body image message for every generation, right? So you can't get free of it, even though as you get older, hopefully, ideally, we're accepting ourselves more and more as we get older because we know ourselves. So it should get easier for us, especially, I think that sometimes there's something really positive that happens once the further away that you get from cultural norms about beauty, sometimes there's something very freeing about it, right? Because you can stop trying to conform to what it is, because you know at a certain point that no matter what you do, you're not going to conform. You can't conform. And ideally, there should be a freedom in that instead of a sense of loss.
And there are many parallels with the issue of disability. And one of the most beautiful stories I've ever read was written by my late husband, Irv Zola, who was a sociologist, a medical sociologist, but also very active in the disability rights movement. And he wrote a number of short stories that were autobiographical. And one of them is called Tell Me, Tell Me. And it's about a date he had with someone who had an even greater disability than he did. He had polio, he used a brace. And it's available at irvingzola.com. There was a website with all his short stories. It's a booklet called Meaningful Relationships, Moments in Time. Each story carries a theme of disability, but there's one about this particular sexual encounter that is so beautiful that I would recommend everyone go read Tell Me, Tell Me, and get an understanding for how important it is to be able to talk to someone and to say what it is you're fearing. You don't want to hurt them, or you don't know what to expect, but if you can be open about it, you get to a much better place of comfort, of pleasure, of feeling mutual satisfaction. And for so many of us, the beginning of figuring something out is the conversation with somebody, with ourselves, with our partners. And that conversation has to be broached at some point to get to the place we want to be.
Yeah. I mean, I feel kind of lucky sometimes that I grew up with disabilities and with chronic illness, because I already knew how to have those conversations, you know what I mean? Before I started to get older, I was having the kinds of conversations that I would be having now much earlier than I was, that I probably wouldn't have had if I was able and I wasn't sick, or even just if I wasn't an assault survivor, right? Even if you're a survivor, you have to have a lot of conversations about your needs and your wants and boundaries and what's okay with you and what's not okay with you and what's different about you that might be other people. But for sure, being able to talk is a big deal. And I think, you know, one thing that I also think culturally is still very pervasive, and we hear young people talk about this all the time at Scarlettine, is the idea that talking about sex isn't sexy, which I've never understood. I don't like, if you like cake, like, you're gonna talk about how good the cake is, right? You're gonna be like, this is the best cake. You're not gonna not talk about the thing that you like, but for whatever reason, we apply the standard to sex. But I think, yeah, we have to be talking. And it's fun. It should be fun to be talking, and we should be getting better at talking. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that so much of the cultural narrative that we have around sex says that everybody's a child, and then everyone has some kind of sexual debut, usually in their teens and 20s, and that's kind of marked as like the only place on the milestone, rather than recognizing that that's the beginning of all of it, and that the older that we get, the more we accumulate the skills that make us able to have good sexual lives, and it's mostly communication.
And for many of us, we grew up thinking that sex and the sex drive is an innate biological thing, and we just have it and we run with it. And there are many sexologists who have been writing about how sex is, it's really a construct, and it's something we learn. It's like riding a bike. You know, you have to learn about it, try it out, you know, experiment. It isn't necessarily, although it could be, I suppose, something you innately know, you feel, and you just do it. And even people who are aroused at times have a lot to learn about what their bodies are capable of, what really works best. And if you're not, it's something you want to explore, it takes time, and sometimes you need help from a partner. There's a fabulous documentary, I'm going to remember it in a minute, in which, oh God, this is an
aging conversation. We're
Yeah.
allowed to forget things.
It's a woman who wrote some of the most wonderful stuff about sexuality, and aging is in there. You talk, I'll think about it.
All right. I mean, but it's also interesting that you say that people kind of do a thing. I mean, everybody that, if we went to every sexual partner we had and we just did the things that we feel instead of having a bespoke situation, we'd be a terrible sexual partner. We probably wouldn't even have very good experiences ourselves, because I mean, even when you say it's like riding a bicycle, we don't all ride a bicycle the same way. We can't all ride the same kind of bicycle. We don't all ride the bicycle the same way. We don't all necessarily all have all the same parts to do it with. And the same is true of sex. And again, hopefully, the older that we get, the more that we know this, right? That every experience is unique. Every partnership that we have we can't expect it's the same thing. I mean, that's another thing that we will hear from young people a lot, is this this idea that you have a certain level of experience and then you know how to do everything, and then you don't need to talk to anybody ever. You're just going to do things, which is not only doesn't include consent really in the conversation, but it also doesn't. How are we going to find out what unique things everybody likes and doesn't like and needs and doesn't need if we just think, okay, now I know how to do whatever you have in your head, these 5 things, and I'm just going to do them the same way with everybody.
You know, I may not think of her name, but I can say that she was interviewed in the wonderful documentary She's Beautiful When She's Angry, which is about the women's movement, late 60s, early 70s, and there's a piece in there about Our Bodies Ourselves and the group that wrote Our Bodies Ourselves. This person is featured even more in another documentary. When we have this posted, the link, we'll add
It's
all
all
of this,
good.
where she talks about how it was her boyfriend who encouraged her to learn about her body when she was probably a teenager at that point. And she talked about how brilliant the moment was where she discovered all these things, and that it was all facilitated by a boyfriend who really had done some reading and thinking about these issues. So it can come from all kinds of
It's true.
places.
No, it's the truth. Should we talk about our false beliefs, our myth busting? We thought that we'd talk a little bit about some false beliefs that people have about things. I can start, or you can start. I know you had a couple on your list.
Yeah,
there, Judy.
I wrote these down because I knew I'd forget them by the time I got here today. And one of them is that the clitoris is smaller than the penis.
Oh, that's a terrible myth.
This was just one of the persistent medical myths that Susan Bennett examined in her overview of women's sexual anatomy and physiology. She reviewed some of the knowns and unknowns about women's sexual arousal to show how the perpetuation of misinformation has paved the way for the development of inappropriate pharmaceutical therapies. She's a specialist in internal medicine at Harvard, and she debunked this clitoral size myth, noting that the visible part of the clitoris is actually comparable to the head of the penis, with a similar erectile structure and legs that are not visually apparent. She also debunked the myth that once lubricated, a woman is ready for intercourse. Not necessarily. Also required for subjective arousal and pleasure are healthy vascular and nervous systems. And she also talked about the myth that vaginal lubrication arises from mucous membranes, and in reality, lymphatic fluid forms the lubricant. When during arousal, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates a rise in blood pressure and a greater output of hormones and neurotransmitters. A lot of this is not well understood. We need to do a lot more research to understand these processes. But what we do know is that so much of what happens, how we experience sex and arousal, all that comes from it, happens in our heads and in our bodies, and it's all kind of, it is mixed up with neurotransmitters, and so many things can affect those neurotransmitters.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the central nervous system and the brain are
Right.
really our sex organs, not our
Right.
genitals, for sure. Mine that I kind of wanted to talk about was the idea, and I don't know, maybe we'll kind of weave in questions. Maybe we'll weave in questions.
Okay.
Because we got one that kind of works with this, was the idea that menopause is a sexual death sentence. And it's, some of this stuff, it's kind of amazing. I've worked in sexuality most of my adult life. I've worked in reproductive health most of my adult life, and we can still think really stupid stuff. I had it in my head before menopause that, I remember I even had a partner that I thought I might be with after, that I kind of was like making arrangements for them in advance, right? Like I was like, okay, if when I go through menopause, I don't want to have sex anymore, then, you know, don't let this impede upon you, which is ridiculous because actually ultimately they were the one that didn't want it anymore and I had no such problems. So I probably should have made the opposite arrangements, but we're not together anymore, so we don't have to worry about that part. But I think that there's a couple of reasons that people think that. One, I think when you talk about it being a construct, it's the kind of construct that you have. So if people have it in their head that what sex is only penis and vagina intercourse or anything going into someone's vagina, then yeah, it's real easy to figure out how, especially when people are starting to have genital changes, that you might think, okay, that's it, it's all gone. We have a question here. I'm going to do the question. We have a question here. I'm going to read the question. It says, a loving lesbian couple married for 20 years are currently in different stages of menopause, but both dealing with low libidos and are struggling with trying to figure out how to still have a somewhat active sex life. Suggestions are appreciated. I think one of the things that I like, Emily Nagoski frames this way a lot, which I appreciate, which is that I think it's much more helpful to think about sex as play and as touch and as connection, right? And if we think about it that way, instead of that we think of, you know, tab A going into slot B, it's a lot easier to figure out how we're going to sustain that over life. If we think, well, we don't have to make whatever this box is that we decide sex is be so small, right? If we widen this box and it's what sex is the way that we want to touch each other, and what sex is the way that we want to be physically and emotionally playful with each other, and what sex is the way that we want to engage our sexualities, again, kind of more what's in here than what's here, with each other, it's easier, I think, to envision how are we going to do this when, again, if the way that we're used to being sexual with each other is changing or it's not feeling right. Whether that's permanent or that's temporary, because, of course, all of this stuff can change. In menopause, you can have a really rough 10 years where you're there, and then all of a sudden everything is different 10 years later.
I think, you know, many couples, not just lesbian couples, have dealt with this challenge, sometimes not going through at the same time and not having the same interest in what to do about it. There are many couples who've described one of them wanting to just cuddle, spoon, you know, watching TV or in bed, body next to body, and just loving that feeling of being entwined by somebody you love and care about. And the other, okay, that's fine, but I want something else too. And they work it out in different ways, that making each other happy, because they each might want something different. And then there's this issue of arousal time. Some couples have said, well, it can happen, but it takes so goddamn long to get aroused that, you know, we're kind of bored. That's real. It's real. And so they watch TV while they're, you know, stroking each other.
Sure.
And they do something that, you know, is occupying their minds and thinking that, oh, the body will come along. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But in the meantime, you're entertained, right? So I've read all kinds of wild things about what couples have done. And obviously, over the years, people have written us extraordinary letters. And most of them I've forgotten, but they're at Schlesinger Library, and there are people who've gone and poured through them and said, you've gotten some very interesting reader responses to your books. And I think that the key is feeling like you care about the other person. There's a kind of mutuality there. You may be in different places physically, but do you care about the other person and their response and what they want? And is there a way you can meet somewhere to please one another, however that might be the case? And it's not always possible. And there are many stories of women who say that their partner just, you know, saw them as no longer attractive. They went off and they were, you know, having an affair with somebody else, and nothing they could do could make a difference because their partner was sort of caught up in the sort of cultural, you know, shoulds about what constitutes beauty.
And I was just going to say, this is what you were saying was just reminding me of what you were, it was bringing me back to you kind of talking about pornography, because I think about that too. I think so often what we're shown in pornography is such a limited menu of things, and it's not just a limited menu of sexual activities, it's context, right? Like, so if someone's to try and imagine what you're describing, let's watch a movie together while we're doing this for 2 hours. They're not going to see media representation of this. And so it's going to be harder to try and figure out how to do it because you're building from scratch without any models.
You know, I just want to say that in the 1970s, we were approached by a man named Ed Brecker, who was a public health advocate, and he worked mostly with sex workers, and he was very interested in protecting sex workers and everybody else. So he came to us and said, you got to put a chapter about, then it was VD, it was venereal disease,
course.
it wasn't sexually
Sure.
transmissible infections at that point.
Right.
You have got to focus on this. It isn't just that you want to use a condom or use a barrier method to prevent pregnancy. You should be thinking about disease prevention. And then he started telling us all this about chlamydia and gonorrhea and, you know, and then tubal occlusion and infertility. That was already available in the medical literature. So we devoted a very large chapter to STDs. And by the way, we kept up with this over the years because it was other public health officials, most of them down in Atlanta at CDC, hardly ever able to say boo about their work. I remember when Califano was finally going to allow for some sort of a press conference in DC about sexually transmissible infections. Maybe it was VD still then, I forget the nomenclature. We were actually going to go down for it. We were going to say something. The last minute, there was an announcement that it wouldn't be about that topic, it was going to be about smoking prevention.
What?
Yeah. We have that. That's in our archives at Schlesinger Library. And I think that it was the head of the VD Control Division who had been so excited, who wrote us the note saying, you know, this is really so sad that at this point in time, and I forget the exact year, we can't talk about this important public health issue in public because it's a no-no. Mm-hmm. So we have come a long way in being able to say these things out loud. Sure. Where we've really, I think, regressed is in having this cacophony of misinformation and stupid SHIT all over the internet. So that's the challenge now.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do another question. We have a question that says, do we feel as though our sexuality changed as we got older and or our understanding of sexuality as a concept?
Well, you know, women all describe that differently. I absolutely can say that, you know, I've had less libido in the last 10 years than in the many decades before, but it's not gone, and sexual pleasure is still important to me. And do I need to be a certain pace or, you know, like, no. It's like when it comes, it's great, and I'm lucky to have a wonderful partner. And so I don't have some of the challenges that other women and men have as they get older. Being in isolation is often a major challenge. And you can be satisfied with a relationship with your own body. Mm-hmm. And there are many who masturbate who feel okay with that. But there are many who would really like there to be some sort of mutual sexual pleasure as maybe they experienced in their younger years. You may have lost a partner, you may have become divorced, and so they're not happy with what is. And it's not easy, especially later in life, to find such a partner if that's what you want. Mm-hmm. So aging, you know, can just logistically be much harder when it comes to this matter of sexual pleasure. But I do know there are some women who get all hot and bothered that they have less libido. And, you know, I don't know what to do about that. You know, it's, you know, from my perspective, there are other things you can do, and like there's lots of things we didn't get to do when we were younger,
Sure.
and it's so maybe there's less time on sex and more time on other things. But I'm not about to fight my natural tendencies. I'm happier to go with the flow and fill in, with the activities that bring me pleasure that don't involve struggle.
I was just going to say that about pleasure, right? That I think, again, sometimes some of the challenge is a headspace challenge because so many people have learned about sex as being about sex instead of being about pleasure, right? And pleasure's a big menu, like.
And they're also told that to be a healthy older adult, you have to have sex in your life.
Right.
That is a myth.
There is something that when I was researching the menopause book that I fell upon that I was like, every time I saw it, which is that the advice that they give you about genital changes if you have a vagina is, and I'm very sorry, everybody's going to do this. Everybody kiss when I'm done. Is use it or lose it. Right? It's so gross. It's such a gross way to put it, right? It's like it's a terrible framework of your own body. It puts pressure on you, right? Then it says, oh God, whether or not you want to be sexual, you better be sexual, or it suggests that, like, your vagina will close up forever and you'll never find it again. And so, but there is kind of a lot of I still think, there is a lot of pressure that's put on people, whether it's something like that, where it's, quote unquote physiological, or again, it's said that you're not a normal person.
This came up at a conference.
Use it or lose it?
No, well, it was related to that. It was many years ago. And one of the women in the audience got up and she said, because they were talking about vaginal dryness and the problems it posed, and it's much more of an issue for older women than for younger women in general. And she said, all I do is I have a tablespoon of olive oil every day. I just like medicine. And my lubrication problems have disappeared. Now, I listened to that thinking, I have never heard this before. I wasn't.
The placebo effect is very powerful.
Well,
I just
the
wanna
thing
put
is
out
that
there.
I then, years later, met someone who did the same thing.
With the olive oil.
And I don't think anyone's done any research on this. And, for those of us who may not have had to think about solutions, but I'll tell you, if I started getting very dry, I'd try the olive oil approach because it can't hurt you. And plus, there are the benefits to taking a tablespoon of olive oil every day. So it's a bit of information that I stored in my brain, and it might come in use someday.
I mean, I do think that you have to, I think, there are things that you have to do to tend to your body more and more as you get older, as with everything else, such as the case with sex. I don't think that I envisioned in my 20s or 30s that I would have to think very carefully about my schedule of sexual partnership with the timing of vaginal estrogen, right? But like you do, and then whatever other medication you take, and then when you have to sleep over here, and then when you've got this other thing scheduled there. But again, that's just part of aging period. Your body becomes something that you have to kind of take more and more care of. You have to pay more attention to what your habits are and your practices are and everything else. I don't think it necessarily is like the enemy of sex or anything, but I do also think that that's something where sometimes people get really hung up on it, that for whatever reason, taking care of their bodies seems anti-sex to them instead of something that's actually in the service of pleasure and care of your body, which is what sex is supposed to be in the first place.
And there is some research on the matter of exercise, and for older people, and probably for younger people as well, but it basically reinforces the natural assumption, I think, when you're getting regular exercise, it's good for you. But it seems to improve sexual response and the experience of sex for many people. The exercise doesn't have to be, getting on a Peloton and going, until you're sweating buckets. But it could be just brisk walking for, half an hour. It can be that kind of exercise. And if you can do it, it's good for all kinds of other reasons, but that is another non-medical approach for people thinking about, my sex response isn't what it has been, and maybe you haven't been as physically active as you used to be.
And exercise is another experience that you get to have in your body anyway, right? Like all this stuff is kind of connected.
Right.
What else? We have another question. Would you like another question, Judy? Or do you have another myth? I know you had more than one.
Well, I think that I just want to reflect on the fact that since Viagra came on the scene, late, March of '98, I think is when it was
Yeah, I
approved.
think you're right.
This phenomenon of seeking pharma solutions to whatever problems we're defining, and some of them may be things that we identify ourselves. We're not filling our brains with stuff from the outside, but some of it may actually be the ideas that fill our brains from the ads we see, the TV shows we watch, all this stuff on the internet. Breeds a kind of inadequacy and a sense that if you really want to be with it or have a good sex life, you better get with it and get some of these, drugs for increasing libido, improving your sexual response. And by the way, the drugs like Viagra that men use for, they've been using them for 25 years. They are working for many men in ways that have produced satisfaction and pleasure, sometimes for the women better, sometimes not. That's variable how women experience that whole thing. But the drugs they have been trying to develop, whether it's to address low libido or lack of sexual response, they largely have been failing.
Right.
And I think it's because it's so much more complicated.
Yes.
And that it is very often not a biomedical problem at root. It's all these other issues we've been talking about.
Yeah, a pharmacological solution to a social problem. It's
And
not
when
really gonna work.
flibanserin came on the market, and
remember.
Intrinsa, that was Procter & Gamble's first drug, or actually it was Ingram. It was a German company, and last name begins with B, but they had everyone on the FDA advisory committee vote against its approval because the data didn't even show true efficacy. And, when you look at those kinds of results, then you just, a few months later, they abandoned their research. And I know it's continued on. There are several excellent documentaries full of good humor about this whole trajectory with Big Pharma looking at this problem, and we'll include them when we post this video recording, really fun things people can watch later.
I mean, it's funny, too, for me to even think about that, because I'm not necessarily sure that we even live in the world that if all of a sudden women and gender-expansive people wanted to be having sex all of the time, the world is even set up for that in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, so much would have to change in order for that to be going on and for everybody to be happy. So it's also, I mean, I don't know, they're kind of putting the horse in front of the cart there anyway. I don't think that they've thought
do you mean
about
the cart
what would
before the
happen
horse?
if it were toward that.
Right.
There's another, we have a question off of Zoom if you're ready for
Sure.
it. I think this is a good one for you, Judy, actually. It says, since it's clear that women's health issues are very underfunded, do you know of any work or campaigns being done to change this?
Well, we just saw, literally weeks or a couple months ago, a pot of money at NIH being allocated for menopausal research. Again, it's probably not all going to be kind of along the path that we would want, but some of it will be. There are a lot of good researchers. We've been very focused on the myths around the perimenopause, and there's a lot of people marketing garbage for women in the perimenopausal period. It's unfortunate. There's a fabulous website that was created originally by two women who met at Harvard Business School in their 40s, I don't know, what they 40s, 30s?
Yeah.
Both having struggles around early perimenopausal experience. Anyway, the long story short is Nina Kozlov has created this website called womenlivingbetter.org. And many of our colleagues, like Dr. Marcy Richardson,
That's great.
Santoro, there are 7 or 8 researchers, Nancy Ream, people that we work with for many, many decades, are now her advisors and helping her with finding the best research, the best content to post at this website. We link to it from our bodies ourselves.
It's really great.
It's really extraordinary. And they presented at some of the NAMS conferences, that's the North American Menopause Society. And I'm so excited that our Bodies Ourselves here at Suffolk is going to be able to collaborate more and more with Women Living Better to lift up the incredibly important content that they have been creating and the deconstructing of these ridiculous assertions all over the place on the internet and elsewhere. There are some entrepreneurs, some of them physicians, who are capitalizing on this vulnerability that, women will try anything in the perimenopause. And I am very glad to see that we've got really creative people like this, intergenerational, thinking all, creatively about all aspects of these issues. And obviously the research that we want to see, not all of it is even starting, but it's going to start, I'm pretty sure.
There's one more. I think I'm probably a better person to take this one. It says, are there unique issues that come up around sex and aging for gender nonconforming, non-binary, and trans people? As a genderqueer person who is socialized male, I'd love to hear more about those challenges and if there are differences from gender nonconforming people. I mean, I'll say this. Speaking for myself, I actually kind of feel like this is one of these things where the older I get, the easier it gets, in part because, again, we've kind of got so much cultural coding around expectations of gender and what people are supposed to look like and what people are supposed to behave like. And and again, almost all of our cultural norms are meant for younger people, right? So the older that we get, the further we get from them, and the less pressure there is to conform to them, because again, there's not really an expectation of conforming to them in the first place. Especially too, I know, when we're talking about menopause, there's kind of a long thread of menopause being presented as this like crisis of femininity, right? We're like, oh God, it's menopause, and therefore if someone is no longer able, and of course there's the presumption, the false presumption that everyone always was, no longer able to have periods, no longer able to get pregnant, no longer able to be reproduce, then is this person even a woman anymore? And some people certainly have this, they experience this way during menopause, but there are plenty of us that's kind of a gift to have it all of a sudden be like, oh, great, the world's not really going to necessarily assign me femininity anymore. And that's not a loss. It's like, it's what I wanted all along in the first place. So it's kind of nice that it's like a gift with purchase. Terrible hot flushes, but on the other hand, no one is necessarily assigning you a certain kind of gender identity anymore.
I don't think we know a lot about older transgender individuals and what happens with sexuality. I think there are some people looking at it now. One of the challenges is that a lot of older people who are transgender weren't sharing that information with very many people.
It wasn't safe to.
Many people moved to another part of the country when they became transgender, right, and nobody knew they were transgender. And it's not clear to me how many individuals in medicine have been interested, because they're still seeing caregivers. And we do want to know, what are the long-term effects of taking hormones decade after decade for some people? We don't know the answer to some of these questions, and they could have a profound impact on sexuality. I do believe there are researchers interested in these questions. I don't know if they've been funded to do this work.
Lucy Fielding is someone that I'll kind of always suggest around this, because she does really great work here. I think, though, too, I do think that a lot of the kind of cultural scripts that we're given around sex and aging are so heteronormative and so kind of cisgender centered that in some ways, I do think that those of us that are kind of further outside of that can have it a little bit easier, just because it's almost like in the same way that it's easier to be queer sometimes. There's not a pre-written script for us. We've gotten to write our own scripts the whole time. So, I mean, one of the things that I'd even say about that question is that I think that a lot of cisgender people have a lot of things to learn, actually, from people who are trans and gender nonconforming that are aging, because there are freedoms to be learned from in there. We have another one. You ready for more? says, very excited this conversation is happening and thinking this is very revolutionary and also political. Do the speakers, this is us, presumably, feel this topic relates to revolutionary politics, if and how the personal is political, which of course it is. I mean, I think so. I think you think so.
Well, I mean, it always was. I mean, the
Right.
second wave of the women's liberation movement had a big focus on sexuality. Many of our partners, our global partners who've translated and adapted Our Bodies Ourselves, it's now in 30 some odd languages and formats, many of them zeroed in on sexuality and female sexual pleasure as being sort of ignored completely by the culture and by certainly in their relationships. And the entitlement to sexual pleasure is something that is new. It's new on the horizon for many in this world. It's not something that has always been there. And I would say that when you look back in the 60s and 70s, where women, may have been active in the peace movement and the civil rights movement, and then the women's movement, they started to feel entitled to sexual pleasure amongst other sorts of rights. They often got a mixed response from their partners if they were married or they had a boyfriend or somebody in their lives. And that generated conflict because why shouldn't my sexual pleasure be important to you? And it was political. I mean, the personal is political, obviously, it was. But it wasn't just about sex. It was about all the things that were in the personal realm. Who's taking care of the kids? Who's doing the housework? You know, who's going to make money? I mean, this idea that women shouldn't work outside the home. Many people back then, even if they needed the money, many men were horrified at the idea that a woman might work outside the home because then he'd be deficient as the breadwinner for the family. Many of those ideas are not prevalent right now, but I think they've morphed into something else.
I mean, that's what I was going to say. Like, I'm really sorry to bring up the election. I'm really sorry.
Can't we forget about
But
it?
I know, but we're here. And we see that the discourse around things like this are things like men in their 20s saying, your body, my choice, right? So clearly we have not evolved, unfortunately, I think in some ways, in some respect, when it comes to sex and gender politics. We kind of did this and then we've looped back the other way. And when you think about things like this, I think if you or me were faced with someone saying something like that to us, we would know that there's some things to say. Maybe a fist would be involved. I don't know. But I think that if you imagine someone in their 20s, we'd like to think that history has been such that they'll know how to counter that. But I don't know that that's necessarily true because it's new again right now.
I don't know what's happening right now in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Because of COVID, we didn't do a lot of campus talking. I mean, things
Sure.
are maybe different 5 years later. But if you look back to 2017, 18, 19, and there were a number of encounters with college-age women, they did express a viewpoint on more than one campus that if my partner isn't going to be interested in my sexual pleasure, I'm not interested in him or her. It isn't just in heterosexual couples that we find this issue. Sometimes same-sex couples don't have equal interest in the other person's sexual pleasure.
That's true.
And that kind of egalitarianism in a relationship can really matter to some people. For others, the sex might not be so important, but when it's important, then it's really political, and it can make or break a relationship over time. I tend to think it's coupled with other things, though, the things around, who's going to clean the house, do the
Right.
child rearing, the other areas where you need give and take for a relationship to make it.
Yeah. Well, I think, what time are we at? I think we have, okay, I think we can take questions from here if anyone
Sure.
has any questions. I can't see anyone.
Yeah, I keep my eye away from there.
But I know you're out there.
They'll take care of it, because we can't see anything.
No, we can't. Oh, okay. All right. We have things happening on Zoom as well. Before we take Zoom, should we, is there anyone that has any questions?
Just speak up
who's
because we can't see anything.
sitting? All right, let's do Zoom. We'll come back to you. This says, hello from Taiwan. Access to info is crucial, especially during this current time of social media and increased political pressures. Suggestions for being able to navigate around the challenge would be welcomed. I'm parsing this. The challenge of information, of access to information.
Well, then maybe this is the moment to do my little laundry list.
Do it.
You know, number one, I think that community-based, affordable, accessible, comprehensive sexuality education would be a better way to offer independent sexuality information and give women power in their sexual lives. It's women of all ages.
Hard agree.
People of all ages. Feminist-owned sex stores are the major source of sex education in many of our communities.
That's true.
That's a sad statement, actually, in my mind. Too much of our content in our schools and even in our churches is controlled by, a school committee or a small group, and we don't have the opportunity to do this at the sort of upper level. SIECUS, which originally stood for the Sex Information and Education Council of the U.S., continues to do heroic work in this space, and they bring sexuality education into schools and community groups all the time. They are an incredible group to support, and they have really been in the nitty-gritty with school committee debates, and especially when transgender children have been harassed, and they've been so extraordinary. I want to mention them as an important national group, helping communities one by one. And obviously, I've already said this, we want to resist medications as first-line approaches to addressing dissatisfaction with our sexual lives. Much wiser to begin with learning about our own sexual responses and improving communication with our partners. And I think it's important to say that in contrast to men, many women don't develop the desire for sex just sitting there in a room, or even talking about it. They need the actual foreplay and sexual arousal to get to the point of feeling that kind of interest in sex in the moment. And it's important to remember that women and men are different in some ways, not all the time. And this is, again, getting back to, learning about this, like you learn how to ride a bike. We need more masturbation education to engender sexual entitlement, self-knowledge, and subjectivity.
I will tell you, our #1 articles on Scarleteen all the time are masturbation articles. And I think that it has to do with the lack of information about it in almost every
And over the
place.
years, even on college campuses,
I'm sure.
not necessarily in the big audience, but afterwards, so many young women said, my partner doesn't want to learn about my body, and, the only way I get sexual pleasure is when I masturbate, and I'd really like that to change, and how do I make that change? And of course, we don't have any magic answers for that.
Different partner. That's my magic answer. Not that partner. Not that partner is the answer.
And then, of course, all the things about eating well and getting exercise. And some women have found that the Kegel exercises, some of us did them after we gave birth. But when you strengthen your pelvic floor muscles, sometimes it makes sex feel better. Not always, but sometimes. So that's another thing. So all of these things, mental health, physical health, relational satisfaction, these are all critical. And I think what we need now, more than ever, are places like your website, Scarlettine, Our Bodies Ourselves, with all of our wonderful advisors, to counter the sort of advice gurus like Laura Schlesinger, who they turn sex into women's social work, you know, to ensure happy families. And in their view, sex becomes a loving obligation of marriage or being a good partner. It's not a source of personal pleasure. And women's sexual pleasure is like a collateral effect of all of this if it happens. It is so interesting to me that Sherry Height, who wrote the Height Report, when was it, in the 70s when it came out? There's another very important book. It was this thick. It had hundreds, if not thousands.
The Height Report on the Family. Yeah.
What'd you say?
Or well, the first was the Height Report on women, then men, then the family.
Right, right.
They're all big. They're all very big books.
But she talked with so many hundreds, if not thousands, of women and men. You just reading that, you get a sense of the enormous variability in what we think, feel, and you know, whether or not we're influenced by the societal messages we get. I still think without those messages, there's enormous variation as well. And you know, it is true that theoretically we're all capable of this thing called orgasm, but it isn't going to be something that everybody you know, seeks as a must, the only thing that makes for good sex, or something that has to happen, or it's a failure. It can be part of a sort of a menu of things that might happen, might not happen, and could be pleasurable. But I think in many minds it is the idea that orgasm has to happen, or else this sex isn't good, that hurts our ability to enjoy and have pleasure from all manner of close physical connection.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, goal-oriented sex is something that we know by now in 2024 is not working out for pretty much anybody.
Right.
I think it's interesting, too, when you were talking about the Shara Height, for instance, right, or when you were talking about Rosetta Wrights, these are all people that collected a lot of information from consciousness raising, right? So you have, and Our Bodies Ourselves, for that matter, where it's anecdotal. And I think when you're talking about kind of the problems of social media, one thing I always kind of like to remind people is that, you know, if you're looking at an Instagram post and it's one slide of, I don't know, 5 things about something to do with sex, you might learn something from the slide. But I think that often where the more interesting, juicy stuff is and where you learn the most is go read the comments, because in the comments then is where you get everybody, is where you get hundreds and hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people. And that's where you see the diversity. That's where you see all of the richness, rather than the one thing that you saw sitting in a story that, you know, you flip past really, really quickly. Because I do think, you know, when somebody's asking about access to information, we always have to ask who's making the information. Again, if the information is coming from pharmacological sources, then obviously they have their own agenda. If the information is coming from government sources, they have their own agenda. But I think that more that it comes from, you know, for the people, by the people, is where we really kind of get to the place where...
And we know now that many sexologists do have connections to the pharmaceutical industry, but like physicians who tend to believe that, it might affect that doctor, but not me, you know, the same is true in the sphere of sexology, and people who are therapists in this field. They know that the pharmaceutical industry is there, but they don't appreciate the depth to which it affects the research agenda, affects what we see on the screen, affects the marketing that we get. It's very easy to dismiss the importance of this sea change since the turn of the century.
For sure. These are some, we've got more good ones. This one says, what information is there about couples where they stay a couple but agree to have one or both of them agree to have other sexual partners? So the information that anybody's going to want to look up there is you're looking for information on open relationships and polyamory. The good news is that in 2024, there's actually quite a lot of really good information. You have some older books. Tristan Taormino's more recent book, I think, is a good one about that. Again, that's something where if you move around on social media, there's a lot of information about open relationships and polyamory. And this is one of the things where when you were talking before about there's different ways to address when there are different desires between a couple, right? So maybe someone in a couple does feel done and they don't really want to have a sexual relationship, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an end of their relationship if they can shift so that their partner can go ahead and have those kinds of relationships with other people without having to terminate their relationship with somebody
Many couples
else.
have done that.
Absolutely.
And there are
absolutely.
also couples who have both wanted to try polyamory, and they discover that for one it works and for the other it doesn't.
It's not for everybody.
And that can be problematic.
No, for sure. Well, and I think it's also funny too, you know, if you kind of want to talk about it as something to do with getting older. I mean, it does require a great deal of executive function. Like, I will say that there's organizing, there's Google calendars involved, you know, like it's, you know, it's not, you know, you have to manage this. So it's not one of those things that's necessarily the easiest thing. But again, I think, I don't know, I think that the older that we get, hopefully we get more creative in our approach to problem solving. Especially if, you know, I think with relationships in particular, if we want our relationships to endure, all relationships are going to change over time. And if we don't change with them, they're not really going to endure. We're going to have to say goodbye and move on to the next thing instead of doing it that way. Do you have anything to say about that, Judy?
You're funny.
No? All right. We have another one. This says, do you find any shift in how people talk about and acquire consent in later years? I like this question. Do we do appreciably better in and around staying safe and getting our needs met?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know if there's been research. One would like to think that as you get older, you learn some things about getting consent and that you're going to be more likely to obtain consent for all kinds of things, sex and otherwise. But I don't know. I have not even heard people talk about it, so I can't give you an anecdote.
I mean, one thing I'll say that's kind of related to this and kind of related to some other stuff that we've been talking about. Do you know Peggy Kleinplatz?
The name.
Yeah, I always like to toot Peggy Kleinplatz's horn and her research partner Dana Menard, and they have a book out called Magnificent Sex, and it's called that because, you know, often when we do studies of sex, we're necessarily studying the things that people consider problems, or again, that pharma considers a problem. But the studies that Peggy and Dana have done have been studies of only people who report that they're having the best sex ever. This is rare, right? We don't usually have this. And there's a lot of interesting findings to be had there. One of them that I always like to talk about is that, I don't know, when I was coming up, there was a really big script. I remember getting really salty about it, where, what were they saying? They were like, picking an age of sexual peak, right? They would say something like 36 is the age at which women or whatever sexually peak. Who even knew what hat somebody was grabbing this out of, right? It wasn't based on anything real. But the research that Peggy and Dana did found that of the people who are self-reporting having magnificent sex, the age that people were reporting was kind of their peak sexual experience was 54. Not 36, not 16, not even 40, but 54. And I feel like, you know, if you're having your peak experience at 54, it's not just that you're having a great time or you're having a great orgasm. It's also going to be stuff like this. It's that you're going to feel able to say yes or no, or maybe, or not today, or yes, but not this way than you were when you were younger. And that maybe you are having partners that are coming to you being better about consent in a step-by-step, seeing consent as something more than just a unilateral yes or no to all sex. So I think that when we see research like that, this kind of bears that out. But I agree. I think our limited script of even how we talk about something like consent is going to limit the kind of research that we do want it, because we're still so often locked in the idea that the only thing that matters about consent, the only reason that it exists, is so people are not sexually assaulted, which is not the only reason for us to be engaging in active consenting processes. I do think that we get better about staying safe and getting our needs met. I like to think so, anyway. That's my experience. I can't speak for
Would be
you,
nice.
Judy. Are we there? Ooh, we're there. We're at time. Do you have anything else you want to
No, I think
get
that,
out there?
I think that it'd be great to have more voices of older people talking about
Absolutely.
their experiences with sex and aging, and not just the gurus telling us what we should want or should expect, but people kind of figured it out on their own. It's very similar when you talk about the menopause too, that separate from what society tells you ought to be, what is your actual experience? And I remember Sonia and John McKinley did some fascinating work, community-based work around women who are going through the menopause, and this is sort of back in the 60s and 70s, and their work bears repeating, I think, if we could do that kind of community-wide study again.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh, Amy
Yes,
has something.
thank you.
to say.
Thank you so much, Heather and Judy. That was really enlightening and pleasurable. And thank you to everybody in the audience for attending, and everybody on Zoom, quite a few people on Zoom. Your support and the coming together of everybody in community is so important now, and I hope that you feel like this is giving you more new ideas, new inspiration, and also a feeling of connection. And this panel discussion, small panel, but still, has been recorded, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone with the recording and a survey to get your feedback on what you liked and ideas for future events. You can find more of this kind of content on ourbodiesourselves.org. We have a lot of sexuality content. We have a lot of content on growing older. And we even have a new podcast coming up called Next Chapters that is being created by Mindy Freed, who's our Growing Older chair, expert panel chair. And you can learn more about this and support it on the Our Bodies Ourselves website. I want to tell you about 2 events that are coming up in the new year. On Saturday, January 25th, we are co-hosting the Massachusetts Menstrual Equity Summit with Mass Now here at Suffolk in Sargent Hall. That's a 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Summit. And on Wednesday, February 19th, we're hosting a book talk with Alice Rothschild on her new book, Inspired and Outraged, The Making of a Feminist Physician. And this will be from 6 to 7:30 in the evening. I want to mention just one comment. We've had a really rich discussion on Zoom. Thank you to everybody who's participated in that. And here's a quote that Laura pulled from Zoom. Quote, "A huge thanks to all the speakers for being so freaking fabulous. So glad you rad humans exist."
Oh.
Yeah. Lastly, if you feel moved or inspired by this conversation, please consider making a donation to Obos Today. And the information has been up here. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you back out in the lobby for more snacks and drinks if you want them.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Amy.